Thanks to those of you who've been with us throughout the afternoon, and perhaps some of you have just joined us. We have talked in our previous panels about a number of very specific kinds of foreign policy, defense, and trade issues. We've talked about tariffs, trade agreements, tax reform, the border-adjusted tax type of model, and how that might affect trade and the economy and fairness in the United States. We've talked about the military and its deployment, or perhaps insufficient or ineffective deployment. We've talked about NATO. We've talked about immigration and refugees and terrorism and lots of things. In specific, our task for this final conversation is to explore in a broader sense what Americans, and perhaps more particularly American conservatives, people on the center right in our current political discourse, what should we be thinking about when it comes to foreign policy? What are America's interests? How far do they extend? How do we define them? What role should America play in the world? What is the strategy in this age of a new president, President Donald Trump? What is the proper strategy, not only for pursuing America's interests, but for thinking about what those interests are and drawing some conclusions and building consensus about what we should do with our various diplomatic and economic and military resources? I think we've assembled a fantastic panel to answer these questions, or at least to begin to answer these questions. I'm not sure we can answer them in one setting. But I want to introduce the panelists to you. First, here on your left, and as I said at the beginning of the afternoon, the way I've structured this is so that we always move from left to right. That is always the right direction to go. Always move to the right. So, Henry now is Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at George Washington University in the Elliott School of International Affairs. He holds a BS degree from MIT and MA and PhD degrees from Johns Hopkins. From January of '81 to July of '83, he served on President Reagan's National Security Council as Senior Director for International Economic Affairs. Professor now co-directs the U.S., Japan, South Korea Legislative Exchange Program, semi-annual meetings between members of Congress, the Japanese Diet, and the Korean National Assembly. He's a member of Phi Beta Kappa, the Council on Foreign Relations, and a recipient of the State Department's Superior Honor Award. Professor now served 2 years as a lieutenant in the 82nd Airborne at Fort Bragg. His most recent book is Conservative Internationalism, Armed Diplomacy Under Jefferson, Polk, Truman, and Reagan. Yes, Polk is included. Those of you who know me well know that James K. Polk is the greatest president. We should always be talking about President Polk.
President to come from Mecklenburg County.
Well, that's true, but that's not only true. All right. Hugh Dugan is the Sharkey Visiting Scholar on UN Studies at Seton Hall University. He's an international affairs scholar and an expert on the United States' participation in the United Nations organization. He has served in the U.S. Diplomatic Corps from 1983 to mid-2015 as a senior advisor to 11 U.S. permanent representatives to the UN and as U.S. delegate to the UN. Dugan served as lead negotiator on many delegations to the UN, such as the UN Peacebuilding Commission, Economic and Social Council, and Committee on Non-Governmental Organizations. Prior to his UN posting, Dugan served in the American Embassy in Mexico City, the Consulate Generalship in Bermuda, and the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs in Washington. Dugan earned his degrees and honors from the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy as a Tuck Fellow, and the Wharton School of Business as a State Department Fellow. He holds certificates from the International Olympic Academy. Does that mean you're an international Olympian? Wow, okay. Now, I've introduced Robert Wilkie, but, I just say once again that he is currently serving as a senior advisor to Senator Tom Tillis and previously served as an Assistant Secretary of Defense under Robert Gates and Donald Rumsfeld. You can consult the rest of the bio if you've forgotten it from last panel. And our other panelist is Ambassador Patrick Duddy. He's a senior visiting fellow at the Fuqua School of Business at Duke University. He's one of the Department of State's most senior Latin American specialists with exceptionally broad experience in trade, energy, public affairs, and crisis management. From 2007 to 2010, he served as the U.S. ambassador to the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela for both President Bush and President Obama. Prior to this, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Western Hemisphere, responsible for the Office of Economic Policy and Summit Coordination, which included the hemispheric energy portfolio, as well as for the offices of Brazil, Southern Cone Affairs, and of Caribbean Affairs. During his tenure there, he played a key role in coordinating U.S. support for the restoration of democracy in Haiti. So those are our panelists, and what we're going to do, as we did before, is begin with some opening remarks on this general question of what should America's strategy be in the current, the new administration and the situation we currently face around the world. And we'll start with Professor now.
All right. Thank you very, very much, John. It's a great pleasure to be here. I was trying to calculate it a minute ago. 54 years ago, I reported for duty at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Spent 2 wonderful years there. My immigrant grandparents lived for over 50 years in Greensboro and are buried there, so I feel very much at home here, and it's a delight particularly to be at the Jesse Helms Center. I met Senator Helms a couple of times, always in groups. I was never that important to meet him individually, but I do remember one meeting early on when I was in the Reagan administration. It may have actually been during the transition when we went up to see him, and my boss was Dick Allen at the time. He was a designated national security advisor. We went up to see Senator Helms, and Admiral Bud Nance was in the office at the time. He was very quickly to become the deputy to Allen, and I remember Helms looking at me and just saying at one point in the conversation, "Young man, you listen to that Admiral." So I did. I think it's terribly important how our presidents think about the world in which they operate. And the reason is because you don't want them just to react to what's going on. You want them to have some sense of where they want to go and some idea of how they might shape events, not just react to them. I worked for a president who did that really more than I think almost any other president in the 20th century, even FDR. That was Ronald Reagan. He thought a lot about foreign policy. We now know he wrote a lot about foreign policy long before he became even governor, let alone during his administration. And he turned events around. By the late 1970s, we were in trouble, big trouble, economic trouble. Soviet Union was on the advance in the world. Oil prices were skyrocketing. And Ronald Reagan confronted a very, very difficult set of circumstances. He didn't say, well, I'm going to react to those circumstances and we'll take care of this little problem and that little problem. No, he had a strategy for how he wanted to proceed. And the first thing he wanted to do, of course, was to rebuild America's military and economic might, all right, for the purpose not of trying to defeat the Soviet Union in some kind of a nuclear war. He didn't mind if they worried a little bit about that. But his objective was eventually to negotiate with the Soviet Union. But to do it, of course, from a position of strength where the Soviets realized that they wouldn't be able to keep up with him unless they sat out at the table and talked with him, and eventually led to the agreements in many cases that unraveled the Soviet Union and led to the end of the Cold War. So let me try to do something here within 7 minutes that's probably not possible. That is, how does Donald Trump think about the world? You know, many of my academic friends, the comeback usually is, well, no one knows, not even if his name is Donald J. Trump. So it's a little difficult maybe to put together some of the thoughts that Trump has, but I think the evidence is clear. I want to argue that, look, he has a fundamentally nationalist view, all right, of America's role in the world, coupled with a few realist elements in terms of his desire to work with some of the great powers, Russia and China, but that he has very little so far. He's given us very little by way of telling us how he would like to shape the world, how he would like to move the world forward. Very few what we call the internationalist elements in his strategy. Let me first sort of tick off the central nationalist elements of his orientation. Now, nationalists generally accept the world as it is. They don't see any great opportunities to change it. They define national security rather narrowly in terms of defending America's territory, borders, and immediate sea lanes. They see no need to help others defend themselves because they have a greater motivation to defend themselves than we do. So they'll take care of themselves. Generally expects the world to kind of take care of itself. But if that world does mess with us, if that world does intervene in some way, we're going to strike back at them very, very hard. You think of Andrew Jackson kind of representing that nationalist tradition. No doubt about the fact that Trump puts America first. I mean, I love the lines in his inaugural address, which is by the characteristic of a nationalist. He said, and I quote, "We will seek friendship and goodwill with the nations of the world, but we will do so with the understanding that the right of all nations is to put their own interests first. We do not seek to impose our way of life on anyone." Now, frankly, Jackson could have said that very well. George Washington could have said that very well. It's important to put America first. He's rebuilding America's military defenses. We heard from Robert earlier, and we'll hear more from him about that, I'm sure. And he is securing our borders. Now, if we are messed with, he's going to strike back. And I think that explains his focus on ISIS and on the Taliban. He has that Jacksonian sort of spirit that you don't mess with us. Maybe that was the meaning of the recent attacks on the airfields in Syria and the bomb in Afghanistan. Now, in trade, he'd like, of course, to win more than lose. He talks about, winning in the trade field and not losing so much. He's very explicit about his economic nationalism. And makes it quite clear that he's got some problems with globalism. We will no longer, he says, surrender this country or its people to the false song of globalism. He wants to bargain tough on trade, has already rejected TPP, and I like the way he's actually maneuvered China, Mexico, Canada into coming to him and saying, hey, we got to preserve the global economy. We've got a lot at stake. That puts him in a very good bargaining position, by the way. And if nothing else, Donald Trump is a negotiator. He knows how to do that. Now, the realist elements in Trump's thinking are also evident, I think, but they're maybe a little fuzzier. And what do I mean by realist elements? Well, I mean those elements where we think we have to engage the world more broadly to try to balance power around the world, not just on our borders, but in Europe, in Asia, and in the Middle East. You can think here of Henry Kissinger and world order. Well, what are those elements in Trump's thinking? Well, first of all, NATO. Now, he did say during the campaign that NATO was obsolete, but even before the election, he said, no, I've changed my mind because you know what? NATO is beginning to pay more attention to terrorism. They've just deployed a division, 4 brigades of troops in the Baltic states and in Poland, and they're getting the message. So in his inaugural address, he said, we're going to reinforce NATO. He didn't say dismantle. We're going to reinforce NATO. So I think there's a element that suggests that he understands that we've got to be engaged in the balance of power, and we've got good allies. All right? He's going to demand more from them. There's no question about that. And was said in the earlier panel, I think the message is getting across. We've been trying that message of burden sharing for, decades. It's never really made an impact. I mean, I'm hopeful that maybe Trump, with his, somewhat idiosyncratic style, will achieve more in that regard. He did send, by the way, envoys abroad, first to the allies and not to Russia and to China. I think that's a good sign. That reflects this sort of realist notion that we need allies before we engage with the major powers like Russia and China. And mostly, of course, he's decided that in a region like the Middle East, where we don't have many friends, you certainly don't cross your best friends, and you don't cause trouble for the only democracy in the region, and that's Israel. So he's made it pretty clear he's going to back Israel. Now, it's the internationalist elements, though, that are missing in Trump's approach up to this point. He doesn't like to think too much, like my boss did, Ronald Reagan, about the importance of defending and spreading democracy in the world. The internationalist is looking for ways to shape the world, change it, not just accept it and react to it, like the nationalist and the realist, but rather to kind of make it a little better place. Now, we go about this in two ways generally. One is by strengthening international institutions. That's sort of the liberal alternative. But there's another way to do that, and that is by using military leverage in negotiations, as Ronald Reagan did, in order to advance the cause of freedom, in order to incrementally weaken authoritarian states and strengthen democratic ones. Now, unlike Reagan, Trump hasn't said a lot about that, and what he said is not very Reagan-esque. He said, for example, last year, it all began with the dangerous idea that we could make Western democracies out of countries that had no experience or interest in becoming a Western democracy. Well, he's got a point there. I'll come back to it in a minute. But on the other hand, I would rather he held out a little bit more hope for the prospects of freedom in the world and America as being a leading force in that fight for freedom. Now, I like his nationalism with a bit of realism, and I'm not overly disturbed by the lack of the internationalist elements up till this point. I think we needed that, all right, after the kind of very internationalist, very liberal internationalist approach of Obama. But I don't know if nationalism and realism are enough. I think we really have to worry about the way the world is drifting politically. And what do I mean by that? Well, if we retreat, as the nationalists would argue, or pare down our role in the world, or if we simply accommodate events like Crimea, Russia's intervention in Crimea, in order to get along with other great powers, the world is going to drift against us. Authoritarianism is going to gain. It's gaining now. It's been gaining ever since 2006. The number of democracies has declined in the global community. And we see both Putin in Moscow and Xi Jinping in Beijing saying they're determined to push back the Western liberal order. They're determined to expand authoritarianism because they know something that we should know, and certainly my president, that is President Reagan, knew. And that is that our defense depends not just on protecting our territory and our borders and our allies. It also depends upon the kind of world in which we are defending ourselves. A world of more democracies is automatically a safer world for America than a world in which the authoritarian powers are gaining. And as I mentioned, since 2006 now, the democratic countries in the world are on the decline. So we need to worry about that atmosphere in the world. We need to worry about the ideological orientation of the world. Just think if the world today, if we had as few democracies in the world today as we did in 1914 or in 1940, we'd have to have a much, much bigger defense than we currently have. So this is a direct element, it seems to me, of our national security policy. I think Reagan understood that, so did Truman. For example, in 1948, when the Soviets blockaded Berlin, and Truman's advisors told him, let's pull out, after all, West Berlin is inside the Soviet zone, let's don't contest it. Truman just looked at him and said, gentlemen, we stay, period. Why? Because Truman understood that, boy, this is the moment now we've got to stand up for freedom in Western Europe. We've got to make it clear that there's more at stake here than just territory. And it was from that moment on, really, through then NATO and the Marshall Plan, that we began to build more democracies in Europe. Look, I'm no fan of the European Union, but boy, I am a fan of the fact that Europe today is open and free and democratic. And I think that's important for us to understand. It's not the world of Nazi Germany or the world of the German Kaiser, or let alone the world of the Soviet Union and its foothold in Europe during the Cold War. Reagan, of course, brought that message of freedom not just to Western Europe, but also to Eastern Europe. When he told Gorbachev, tear down this wall, he wasn't talking about military defense, but he was talking about national security. That is, he was talking about a world now in which Europe became whole and free, and therefore a much safer part of the world from the standpoint of our interests. Now, it's not easy to do this. It costs something to do this. And this is where we have to really respect, I think, the American people, and I'm probably over my time already, but this is where we have to respect their schizophrenia, it was said earlier, or their caution about being involved in too many places too deeply around the world and sending our troops off for 10 or 15 years into places like Afghanistan and Iraq and earlier Vietnam. Now, I'm going to propose something very simple here, which will cause a lot of headaches, I suspect, for military planners and others, but it's one way of trying to make the costs of an American leadership role in defending and expanding freedom around the world, make those costs more acceptable, bring them down. And what I would argue is we need to set some priorities. We need to worry about the conflicts in the international arena that really matter for freedom. If we lose freedom, for example, or the prospect for freedom in Ukraine, let alone in Poland or Hungary or in the Baltic states, we've lost a lot. We've lost a lot more than if we lose democracy, which has never really existed in any significant form, in Iraq or Afghanistan or earlier Vietnam. So we should keep our eye on the ball. And the ball is on the border, what I call the major frontiers of freedom, between Russia and the European states, who are now free and democratic, and the frontier between China and the democratic allies of America in Asia. So the conflict in Asia is Korea. Boy, if Korea someday is united and it falls under the influence of China, we've lost big in Asia. So those two conflicts we really need to focus on. In other parts of the world, I would urge us to take care of threat. If we get hit by a Taliban, go in and strike back, but don't station huge amounts of forces and spend massive amounts of money over decades trying to bring democracy to these countries. Put in another government a little bit better, stay over the horizon in case the situation deteriorates again and you have to go in. I mean, look, if they start training terrorists and we see that they're about to attack Europe or what have you, you go in, put in 30, 40, 50,000 forces if you need to take care of it, but then come back. Then come back and let the local forces work with it. It's not going to be perfect. It's going to be messy. A lot of these groups can't get along, for example, in Afghanistan and Iraq. But we can do this a little bit, I think, with a little bit less cost than we have in the past. Still dealing with threat, but making sure, above all, that we don't get diverted. We don't get diverted from the central battles. And by the way, in the last 10 years, that's happened to some extent. We've gotten preoccupied with Iraq and Afghanistan, and we've lost ground in the Crimea and Ukraine, and maybe even in Korea, which is, you know, a fantastic example, by the way, of a country becoming democratic, but it's having some real trials for its democracy these days. Well, that's fighting for freedom, I argue, conservatively, or that's conservative internationalism.
Thank you much. I'll take this.
Sorry.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. It's quite humbling to follow Professor now. He's a professor. I have to admit I'm a confessor, because although I call myself a professor, I couldn't come up to his scholarship and his history of service over time. I've been lucky to be a professor just for a couple of years, having served as a U.S. Diplomat for many years at the United Nations. And I did study business, as John mentioned. And when I was looking at my career, I thought, well, should I go into business or diplomacy, et cetera? And I thought, well, diplomacy is pretty good because I hear the conflict is a growth industry. And shortly thereafter, I went to the UN, and the Berlin Wall came down. It looked like peace was breaking out, and that concerned me a great deal. I thought maybe I made the wrong choice in career, but I haven't been disappointed since then. I do teach two courses. One's on United Nations reform, and one's on United Nations Security Council. And I'm going to give you the Cliff Notes version right here. It's kind of like Twitter for college students, a few more than 140 characters, but I'll try to stay within the limit. But first, I do have to admit my connection with North Carolina. We're very close friends with the Belk family. Erwin Belk is 95 years old now, and he took me to the department store yesterday, and all the employees couldn't have been nicer to him. And anyway, he actually introduced me to my wife, and I was quite impressed with Irwin Belk because Senator Helms actually recruited him to come up to the United Nations kind of as his spy for 2 years on the U.S. delegation in 1999 and 2000. We were undergoing a period of arrears. The U.S. was not paying its dues because we were dissatisfied with the UN's performance. We didn't think that it was responsible, accountable, and the U.S. was paying 25% of its dues and getting punished every day on the floor of the General Assembly rhetorically. So what happened, we ran up these $1 billion in arrears, and that started to really cripple the organization. Senator Helms and Senator Biden collaborated on historic legislation whereby we negotiated at the UN quite a few important reforms and also were able to lower our dues amount permanently every year by a significant amount. Senator Helms and Biden and the entire committee came to New York, and Ike Belk put together a fabulous event for them to meet all of the other delegates there. And we had a major session in the Security Council, and the senator himself spoke in the Security Council, which was a very unusual opportunity for a member of Parliament to have that audience. And he made his point very clear, and to the extent that a few weeks later he invited all of the members of the Security Council, the 15 ambassadors, to Washington. And they obliged, they went down there, and he sat them down in the old Senate chamber, and they didn't realize that they were going to get a lesson. He recruited the historian of the Senate to remind them of the role of the U.S. Senate in foreign policy matters, and that indeed we have a separation of powers, and treaties and appointments and many other important international matters are in fact the purview of the U.S. Senate, not the White House. And they took that lesson in good stride. So it was quite a privilege to have been able to collaborate with him and his staff in creating that landmark legislation that regularized our dues. Now that was a grand strategy, and that's the topic here. Grand strategy in that we not only won a major funding battle at the UN, but we recruited savings every year thereafter in the post-battle era. Such as grand strategy. It takes account of expanding our military means to include diplomatic, financial, economic information, and other things. But grand strategy also looks at what we have internally in our country, in addition to our external projection. Things such as a conscription, the political capacity of Congress to legislate effectively, perhaps to actually employ the War Powers Act from time to time. And also, grand strategy involves a third thing. We have to consider in the course of our projection of force overseas what will happen in periods of peacetime after wartime. So in addition to warfare, which we always hope is temporary, we also have grand strategy to have us think about peacefare, which is regrettably always temporary. So while the horizons of strategy are bounded by the war, grand strategy looks beyond the war to the subsequent peace. At this point, it must include looking at peacefare or peaceful arrangements beyond the war. So this brings us to the United Nations organization again, and I believe why Senator Helms was able to make a big difference up there, and why he considers this part of his legacy and his accomplishment as reflected in the Helms Center diorama, which is a point of pride for Mr. Belk as well. That the United Nations organization is part of what comes after conflict. It was fashioned to keep the peace by avoiding another world war. Let's look at it today with regards to serving U.S. interests today on promoting U.S. values in this new age of Trump. The United Nations is another name for the Allies during World War II. And the United Nations existed before the United Nations organization. I hope you'll all take that home with you and remember the United Nations is different from the United Nations organization. And what we have in New York, the machinery, the buildings, the processes, that's the United Nations organization. But it's the spirit of the Allies that overcame trouble in World War II that gave birth to this organization, because they realized at that critical moment after the war, there was a historic moment of openness to agree to continue collaboration past the war for international cooperation, because the principal purpose of the United Nations is to prevent return to war, to prevent the scourge of war in our lifetime again. And when it was formed, there had been 2 world wars. And thankfully, we haven't seen anything to that extent in 72 years of its existence. And maybe it's because of the UN or in spite of the UN organization. But we did not want to have the scourge of war again in our lifetime. And international peace was something we needed to ensure by maintaining contact and dialogue and cooperation. So instead of having diplomacy in the shadows with side deals, dominoing into group kill, where countries all of a sudden call up each other, oh, we've got to go and defend our ally because we have a secret treaty with them. Instead of that, now we would have something called conference diplomacy. So it's conference diplomacy. It's as we are here in a conference setting. It's not two countries doing something over here and then two others over there. So conference diplomacy was more or less refined and put into this organization to serve peace past the surrenders, past the armistice. As such a permanent organization for conference diplomacy, the UN would remedy the failings of the League of Nations. The League of Nations, as you recall, existed after World War I, and it failed and devolved into World War II. Although both the League and the UN organization were international crisis management go-tos for states threatened by insecurity from abroad, the big difference between these two go-tos was that the UN alone was a keep at. So what do I mean by being a keep at? It kept countries at the table. Walking away from the table had little consequences for those countries during the League of Nations. They just didn't like what was being said. They had no incentive to stay. They walked away and the League failed. But the United Nations invented the veto power. This is what keeps the most powerful countries at the table, even when they're at great odds with each other. How is it possible? Well, if 4 of the other major countries were ganging up on the fifth one would have walked away during the League of Nations and planned war. But in the UN, the 5th country can simply veto what the other 4 countries have ganged up and planned to do. So that's the purpose of the veto. It's not to show you're big in the world, and it's nothing that a small country ever really needs. It's something that a country has that prevents their national interests from being overtaken by a group of other powerful countries. You can say it leads to stalemate, but it also keeps the peace. Now, what happens if a country decided they didn't like these rules? Well, that happened with Russia in the 1950s. They were upset that the UN failed to recognize failed to recognize the People's Republic of China in the Security Council. Instead, the nationalist Taiwanese China was sitting in the Security Council. So the Russians decided they're going to boycott the Security Council. We're not going to come to the meetings. We're going to make our point. You'll miss us. Well, during their absence, the Security Council authorized the Korean action in the Korea theater, which the Russians otherwise would have vetoed, and they came to regret that immediately. So the Russians missed out. The Korean agreements took hold, and the Russians learned thereafter, we better never skip or boycott or leave this because our interests are going to be overtaken. So this gives rise to the diplomatic maxim that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. With all that in mind, let us hope for ongoing and improved conference diplomacy, that it keeps us talking instead of producing military options. And secondarily, let's hope for the health of the United Nations organization. So I put that in that order. Let's make sure we have openness, a conference diplomacy type of spirit in the world. If it's at the UN organization, wonderful. But let's not let the failings or the misgivings of our participation or anyone's participation at the UN preclude the overriding need for conference diplomacy. I'm going to cut my remarks a little short and take questions later, but I'd like to just reflect upon the utility of conference diplomacy regarding U.S. interests and values in the Trump administration. Now, I say U.S. interests and U.S. values, and those are 2 distinct things. I do not believe that the Trump administration is walking away from the United Nations or harbors the animosities toward it that the hyperventilating critics out there have been arguing. But nor will President Trump continue the efforts to repurpose the organization's focus from dealing with international matters to a more liberal interpretation of the UN for intra-national matters. Much of the activity of the UN, the Security Council, its peacekeeping operations, 95% of those operations are dealing within countries, not between countries. It's not international, it's intranational. They're dealing with failed states, they're dealing with regions that are destabilized, they're dealing with countries that suffer from narco-trafficking, other destabilizing factors. And they do so with the argument that, well, it's not international, but we have to be preventive, and if we don't take action now, this will spread and it will be destabilizing in the region, and then it will be international. So this interpretation of the UN has unfortunately put us into many peacekeeping operations which have festered and foundered for decades because we haven't been brave enough to come to an outcome that settles the crisis at hand. We're satisfied with maintaining a status quo, however unacceptable it might be. I believe that President Trump might regard the United Nations as he would regard one of his commercial properties when he was in business, with the UN Secretary General as the manager of that property, for which the U.S. pays 25%. Not looking at the Secretary General as others have tried to, as the world's moral conscience or as the world's senior-most diplomat. I have news. He is the world's employee. We hire the Secretary General. We select him for 5 years, or the term has usually been about 5 years. Over time, there's been this customary impression that this person has the moral conscience of the world, or he's the steward of all that's right in the world. Well, that's wonderful, and we hope he proposes and lives up to those norms. But in fact, he is our Secretary General, the Chief Administrative Officer of the organization. And that's his title in the UN Charter. So I think that President Trump regards the Secretary General very much as a steward, as the caretaker of the organization. And that may explain why he hasn't seen him until about 2 weeks ago. Well, months into the presidency, he didn't even meet the Secretary General yet. I think he was hoping that there would be an opportunity where they could register some UN successes before they met, perhaps. But what he did do just 2 weeks ago, he invited the permanent members of the Security Council, 15, to the Oval Office, which was a very rare special courtesy, I would have to say. And there he made clear that although he is a budget guy, he wants accountability for the taxes that we pay that go toward the UN. He wants to see results up there. Although he is that type of a budget guy, he said if the Security Council can indeed forge some useful consensus on today's important issues, do something, let's say on Syria, or maybe find a definition of terrorism, or agree that something is in fact genocide when we all know it's genocide. It can't do those things. But if it can do those things and start showing up for itself, then he would be less of a budget guy because he would realize that the resources we're spending up there would be relative pennies to such new successes. So he offered them optimism. He gave them a pep talk. So this isn't someone who's walking away or destroying the international order, as his critics are quick to assert. It seems that the president's transactional style would be open to a UN organization that's more than a series of wishful cocktail parties. So to be blunt, I would say it's a matter for the Security Council now to show up or to shut down, so that efforts for conference diplomacy might find better forums. So I see the president regarding the UN organization as unimpressed by its 72-year-old hardware, but interested in the software of the organization, its processes, and its potential. Where he will continue to surprise and perhaps irritate us is in his willingness and his instinct to override the UN's default settings in favor of protocols for controlling the international policy narrative of the day. His only real strategy about the UN may strike strategists as too facile to be called strategy, and that being, does it work for us? In the coming months and years, I expect that the Trump administration will continue to be at the UN's table, and not only to avoid being on the menu. He will be there to assess the fare of its smorgasbord and its capacity through conference diplomacy for securing our interests while hopefully promoting our values whenever possible. Thank you very much.
Pick up on the professor's remarks. It was Joe Biden who said that if only Nixon could go to China, only Jesse Helms could fix the United Nations.
That's true.
So I'll go back to Helms and my intern time, and he was a great teacher, and this is 1988, 87, I'm sorry, 87. Soviet Union's still with us. And he said, you know what Andrei Gromyko would do every day for lunch? Now, I don't know if you remember Gromyko. He was sort of the stereotype of the sinister Soviet. One eyebrow, looked like he was, he'd wear a trench coat. He was just the epitome of what we thought the Soviet Union was. And Senator Helms told me Gromyko would collect 2 slices of black bread and some beets. And he would go into his office, close the door, and he would stare at this massive map on the wall of the world with the Soviet Union in the geographic center of the map. And Gromyko would think about grand strategy. The world is a chessboard. And as we've heard today, we haven't had anyone in a position of national leadership since Ronald Reagan, and then before that, Henry Kissinger, who would contemplate what is American grand strategy. And in the last panel, I mentioned comically Mark Twain. Well, Twain actually went around Europe toward the end of the 19th century, interviewing, discussing topics with the leaders of the continent. He met with Queen Victoria. But he also met with Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor, who was out of power. He'd been tossed aside by the Kaiser. And Twain asked him for his opinion of the United States, and he said, well, I've come to the conclusion that God protects 3 things: fools, drunkards, and the United States of America. And then he said, you know, Mr. Twain, as I look at this next century, and I probably won't see it, I think that the greatest trend coming is that the North Americans speak English. Now, what Bismarck was saying in his own inimitable Prussian way was that the great barrier to German glory, the United Kingdom, would be supplanted by a country that shared the United Kingdom's liberal worldview. And he was right. If you look at the patterns of American diplomacy, American grand strategy, we have very much reflected the grand strategy of the British Empire at its height. Protect citizens abroad, open the lanes of commerce to freedom, free flow of goods, free flow of ideas, establish alliances around the world to prevent the rise of a hegemonic power. And actually the first manifestation of that was way before Bismarck's time, in the early 1800s, when Senator Helms' great hero, his greatest hero, I think, Thomas Jefferson, dispatched the entire United States Navy to the Barbary Coast to teach the Barbary pirates, our first encounter with Islamic terrorism, that the United States was not to be trifled with, even a young United States. He sent 6 frigates, and we now know, and we know in the words of the Marine Corps hymn, to the shores of Tripoli. So that in a nutshell is what American grand strategy has been, and that is the protection of a liberal, small l, world order. Now, I'm not going to be able to delve into these subjects with the depths of the very distinguished diplomats who are with us, but I want to talk about one item that informs one part of grand strategy, and that is the kinetic side. It's the one thing that I was raised in. And, you know, we meet today at a very dangerous time for the indispensable nation. Think about it. Kiev is ablaze. For 8 years, Israel has felt abandoned. Putin, with very limited resources, has routed practitioners of American foreign policy and achieved, maybe, hopefully temporarily, the ancient dreams of the czars by planting Russian boots on the warm sands of the Middle East. We've got Islamic jihadis practicing or engaging in a genocidal savagery we haven't seen since Hitler and Mao. Not on that scale, but certainly if they had the means, they would do it. And we have Chinese generals who openly discuss settling millennial scores with their neighbors. So that is the plate that Mr. Trump has been dealt. The means to address those problems are weak. I'll give you an example, and I apologize because when I was thinking about this, one of the reasons I went into politics is because I can't do numbers. So I had to write this down. But let's look at the lay of the land. And first of all, I'll start with something that my former boss, Bob Gates, said 5 times between the end of World War I to the end of Desert Storm, America has disarmed precipitously, and we have paid the price. He also said, when it comes to predicting the nature and location of our next military engagements, our record since World War II has been perfect. We've been wrong every time. The only way to buffer the common mistakes that we make in planning for the next war is to have enough redundant capacity in the Department of Defense to make sure that those mistakes do not cost America dearly. And I can say that in my lifetime, I've seen that, and I'll give you the anecdote. I've seen it here in North Carolina. In the 1970s, when we drew down from Vietnam, the Army was at a very low point. My father would have to arm himself to go into his barracks. And he was a commander of elite troops in the 82nd Airborne Division. Friday nights, the door to our dining room at Fort Bragg would open. And if you were to look on it, the dining room, there was a massive map of Fort Bragg, and my father would be there with the chief engineer of the 82nd Airborne Division and the provost marshal of the 82nd Airborne Division, and they would plot how to send teams into the Special Forces cantonments to siphon off gas to bring back to the 82nd, because in the Carter years we had no gas. So the 82nd Airborne, which was tasked with responding with a brigade, 3,000 people, the professor noted at the beginning in his service in the All-American Division, we couldn't make it to Harnett County, much less Africa or the Middle East. So I've seen it in my lifetime at its nadir. And in the last 8 years, we have come close to those times. So let's just look at the statistics. Today, the United States Navy is the smallest that it has been since 1911. 6 years before we entered World War I, that's the administration of William Howard Taft. The U.S. Army is the smallest it has been since 1940, and the United States Air Force is the smallest that has ever been. When Ronald Reagan left office, the United States Navy had 592 ships, When Barack Obama took office, it had 285, and he left us with 260. The Navy leadership says that we need a minimum of 308 ships to execute our current missions. But in a more dangerous world, with the lack of naval diversity, our existing ships and crews are being asked to do more than the ships can take. In 1998, only 4% of the Navy's deployments lasted longer than 6 months. With Barack Obama, all Navy ships were deploying more than 6 months. The Air Force is not just the smallest it has been since the great Harry Truman created it in 1947. The average age of its aircraft is older than all of the Air Force's pilots under the rank of lieutenant colonel. As I mentioned earlier, the last B-52 came off the assembly line 3 months into the Kennedy administration. 3 generations of the same family have flown this aircraft, which will in all likelihood, stay in service until the 2040s, which is 90 years after originally entering the fleet. We have experienced in the last 5 years, and I say this as an Air Force officer, my pilot colleagues have been raiding Air Force museums for spare parts for museum pieces. And that is where we are at a time when more rapacious competitors like China and Russia are modernizing. To give you an example of where the Army is. 6 years ago, it was at 553,000. When Obama left, it was at 450,000. The Marine Corps in 2009 had 202,000 active Marines. Today it is down to 130,000. Our nuclear forces are in need of modernization, and I failed to mention that in a recent inspection, every one of our Navy's cruisers had significant cracks in the hull. So, let me get back to the Jesse Helms work. Senator Helms always told us to condense every issue that we confronted to the North Carolina dinner table. He said, what are people in Hendersonville, or what are people in Lumber Bridge talking about? And on this issue, North Carolina, more so than any other state in the country, bears the price of a military that is not able to fight and sustain America's commitments around the world. I call it the Highway 24 paradigm. Those of you who know Eastern North Carolina, Highway 24 stretches from Fayetteville over to Jacksonville. So on the eastern end of Highway 24 sits 45% of the entire United States Marine Corps in 2 counties in our state. On the western end is Fort Bragg, what my father and his comrades called the hub of the universe. There are more active duty soldiers at Fort Bragg than Her Majesty has in her army in the United Kingdom. About 60% of the Army's Special Forces capability rests at Fort Bragg. The reason I say all of this is that from what Senator Helms told us about the North Carolina dinner table, is that if America responds to a threat overseas, 9 times out of 10, it will be North Carolina as the tip of the spear. And we owe it to those soldiers and Marines to retool, to recapitalize, to once again invest in the things that have made us strong. So to Mr. Trump now, he made it very clear in his campaign that retooling the military would be his priority. He is selected in Secretary Mattis and General McMaster 2 high practitioners of the art who understand what it takes to prepare men to fight. I can tell you that in the lead up to the confirmation of the secretary, one statistic that he threw out was that only 3 brigades in the United States Army are fully combat ready. They're here in North Carolina. We have to reverse that trend. If we don't, then all those nice things we said about grand strategy, and a strategy that has its deep roots in the Anglo-Saxon experience, will come to naught, and the price that North Carolinians pay will be very high. Again, I'm very excited. I don't know that excited is the word. I'm very pleased that there is a renewed focus on building up a military, rebuilding a military so that we don't have to use it. Secretary Mattis said that he wants the military to fit into the diplomatic glove of the State Department, because I do think for too long our first option has been people from North Carolina going overseas, and these gentlemen are more practiced in the ways of trying to create a world, stabilize a world where those North Carolina soldiers and Marines don't have to fight. So I will leave it at that and just comment on any observations John has about the military, the armed services side of grand strategy. And I thank you again for your attention.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you all very much. I'm delighted to be here. I'm grateful to my companions here on the dais for their expanded definition of 7 minutes.
I came in at 7.
Sure you did. And you're the one who acknowledged you're not good with numbers. It really is a pleasure to be here. And particularly to be a part of this panel. As we have heard so much and so eloquently about about these military considerations, and I note I was in the Strategic Air Command at the very end of the Vietnam War, and over the last 35 years have actually more than that now worked frequently with the military, which I still do, and both attended and taught at the National War College. And I appreciate these really startling statistics on the state of our armed forces. But for the purposes of our discussion today, I'll make just a few observations and then we'll leave some time for questions. The first observation I would make is that grand strategy is not synonymous with national security strategy. And this is a first, and I think it's a very important consideration. The Atlantic Council a year or so ago brought together quite a number of very senior military people, as well as some diplomats and others, to do a study on whither the U.S. in advancing our national interests. And they both titled but also concluded that one of the most important things that the public needs to understand is that in protecting our interests and in contributing to the kind of world in which we want to live and the world we wish to leave our children, it requires all elements of national power. And our economy is a big part of that. Ergo, strengthening our own economy, strengthening our domestic economy contributes to our security. It obviously involves the military, but it involves our diplomacy, and it involves public diplomacy, or the values that we have come to represent around the world. When I first entered the Foreign Service, I remember flying down to the U.S. Embassy in Santiago, Chile. When I did that, first of all, I flew down in an airline, betraying my age, that has long since disappeared, Braniff Airlines.
It was colorful.
It was very colorful. And we stopped in every Bergendorf all the way down the Cordillera of South America because there just wasn't that much commerce, broadly defined or even commercially defined. There just wasn't that much movement back and forth. Another reality. Every country in which we stopped on the way to Santiago was a military dictatorship. And almost every country was flirting with economic collapse. Now, when we looked south, the chapeau under which we considered virtually everything was the threats emanating from Eastern Europe, from the Soviet bloc. It was the Cold War, even in the Americas, right? Even in the Americas. We understood that these smaller republics, also Americans, constituted individually and in the aggregate a great vulnerability to us. And we paid a lot of attention to that. And over the years, the United States contributed to the evolution of the region. Recently, in connection with a couple of other speaking engagements, I've been scanning some of the current literature on national strategy, and including even Richard Haas's recent book called A World in Disarray. Richard is a former State Department colleague and currently the president of the Council on Foreign Relations. And I'm not sure he even mentions Latin America. Now, for a guy that spent time in Chile during the Pinochet regime, the Dominican Republic when it had difficulties, Central America during the civil wars, Paraguay after the coup, Bolivia in the middle of the drug wars, Panama as we were getting ready to turn over the Panama Canal, Brazil in the transition from Fernando Henrique Cardoso to President Lula, and twice as ambassador in Venezuela. Some of you may know I was thrown out by Hugo Chavez in the middle of all of that. Not even to see a mention of the hemisphere, for me underscored something really important, and that is that we sometimes shrink our strategic vision down to the world of immediate threats. I absolutely acknowledge the importance of those threats. I'm alarmed at the statistics you cited on the state of our military. But our interests, not just our threats, our interests are big, right? They are global. And because I work particularly on Latin American affairs, I just want to point a couple of things out before I launch into a few other observations. I look at the national security strategy when it is periodically dusted off or edited, or recent studies by scholars and diplomats. I look for something on Latin America because I know that today, in the year of our Lord, 2017, think about this, 42% of all of our manufacturing exports, all go to the Western Hemisphere. Are we paying attention? Mexico, about which we've heard a good bit these days, and Mexico buys more from the United States than China. And of course, Canada buys a lot more from us than Mexico. 3, and depending on the week, sometimes 4 of the largest foreign suppliers of petroleum to the United States are in the Western Hemisphere. Just out of curiosity, how many of you realize that in the top 5 suppliers of petroleum to the United States, only 1 is in the Middle East? And in January of this year, Canada exported more to the United States, not only more than Saudi Arabia, 4 times more, right? 4 times more. This is extraordinary, right? This is extraordinary. We have a lot of interest in the hemisphere. And if you've been following the news lately in my old portfolio in Venezuela, we have a pretty important country in near collapse, right? Do we care? I think that we do, and I'll tell you why in just a minute, but I would remind you, as a preamble to that Venezuela has more oil than Saudi Arabia. A little known fact, more oil than Saudi Arabia, and it is destitute and approaching failed state status. An observation before I move to a couple of other points. I think we need to open our aperture as we consider the nature of the world as it is. I'm sort of define myself as being a part of the realist school, by and large. And I think we need to understand the stake we have in the international system. Not that it can't be improved and shouldn't be, but that we have a stake in the international system. And I would also offer the observation that if we fail to pay attention to some of these issues, which perhaps are not as immediately apparent as threats, we will pay a price. We will pay a price. Another anecdote, or kind of anecdote. About 10 years ago, when I was serving as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Caribbean, the government in Haiti collapsed, parenthesis again. President Aristide fled the country. Now, about 10 years ago, you may recall, we were pretty busy as a nation and militarily elsewhere, right? Elsewhere. So, as a nation, we didn't really want to have to send massive numbers of troops to try and restore order in Haiti. And at the same time, we understood that chaos on an island effectively just off our coast could have real ramifications for the United States. We've already seen in the United States the impact of massive waves of unanticipated immigration. You'll remember the Mariel boat lift, right? Eventually, diplomatically, working with the United Nations, working with the Organization of American States, working with some of our allies, France, Canada, and others, we helped to put together a UN mission, including a military mission, to go in and restore order. The United States committed no troops to that operation. The Brazilians had 1,500. The Uruguayans had 1,500. The Chileans had 500. The Argentines had 500. I make this point partially to, if you will, invite you to think just a little bit about a map. None of those countries is nearly as close to Haiti as we are, right? As we are. And we did not, because of the commitments of the region through the United Nations and the Organization of American States, we did not have to send troops and in any way erode the capability we were directing at the wars in Central Asia and the Middle East by sending large delegations or large commitments, brigades or what have you, to the island. We have an interest, I would argue, we have an interest in the international system, and I would remind you that we played the principal role in setting it up, right? We played a central role in setting it up, and more often than not, it serves our collective interests. Now, as we think a bit about grand strategy, I would note I'm entirely comfortable with the idea of putting America first. Indeed, as a diplomat, I thought that's what I was doing. The other thing that I would argue is that putting America first, making sure that our country is strong and capable, is not inconsistent with being a good global citizen. Now, eliding over lots of caveats or explanations, let me make a couple of points. At the end of World War II, we were predominant in virtually every arena, militarily, economically, politically. At the end of the Cold War, we were again predominant. And we have for decades now in the United States premised our thinking about strategic matters on the notion of primacy, that we should be preeminent. I don't necessarily think we need to back away from that, but I do note that the world has changed, and it is less, practically speaking, it is less prudent than it ever has been to think of doing things alone. To think of doing, we need alliances, and we have a stake in the international organizations which we helped to set up, and indeed we, in a sense, foisted on much of the rest of the world in the era right after World War II, in which we have historically, periodically refined moving forward. We are in a world not only of some traditional threats. The foreign policy think tank / analytical group Stratfor today published a new paper underscoring that Moscow, that the Russians are resurgent in their part of the world. There have been a series of articles lately, and there was a hearing in the Senate on May 10th about the rise of China in Latin America. And China, by the way, has become significant. It's part of the reason I think I emphasize that we need to pay attention. China is now Brazil's largest trading partner, and Chile's largest trading partner, and Peru's largest trading partner. It's the second largest trading partner for many of the other major nations in the Americas, and it is the largest creditor for Venezuela. So Russia is resurgent. China is expanding its global footprint. We need to think about the implications of those moves and be prepared to contend, and I don't mean militarily in the case of China. To some degree, what I mean is compete, but also define what kind of a world we want this to be, understanding that, for instance, the quality of the commerce, I think many of us would argue, between the US and Latin America is of one order, and the commerce, largely commodity-driven with China, is something else. We're also looking at new categories of concern. Cyber is a big one, right? And just recently I helped to bring a gentleman who was for 8 years the director of the National Security Agency to Duke for a series of conversations. In a public forum, he noted that our cyber defense as a nation was terrible. That's a quote. How was it? How is it, General Keith Alexander? He said, "Oh, it's terrible." That's the quote. Right? We have to be mindful of that. Right? We have to be mindful of that. But also, we're now looking at other categories of threat, transnational crime, and threats emanating from non-state actors. Typically, we think of this as terrorists, but what I would ask you to consider when we think about non-state actors is the fact that threats are emanating from groups that are not necessarily defined in any important way by geography requires that we think in new ways about how we will defend ourselves. If attacked, how do we strike back? What's appropriate? Right? I offer an observation on something like cyber. We tend to think that cyber attacks are essentially digital. But what if a cyber attack takes out the electrical grid for the triangle? How many people die in a local hospital? What do we do about that? How do we contend? How do we deter? How do we respond? I think going forward, there are going to be some very big questions for the Trump administration. Some of them will have to do with trade. NATO obviously is on the agenda, and I think the statistics that I've cited will be important to the administration. At the same time, I note, one of my other jobs was, as Deputy Assistant Secretary, was also to oversee the Office for Economic Policy toward the hemisphere. And I was around as we were attempting to implement, for instance, the free trade agreement in Central America and the Dominican Republic. And one of the things we said then, and that we said later, as we announced the achievement of a new negotiation with Peru and the initiation of negotiations with Colombia and Panama, was each one of these agreements, we said, was better than the last one. The first one was NAFTA. Logically, what that means is we all acknowledge, including the Mexicans, that there's plenty of room to improve an agreement which, while much debated, has clearly become a cornerstone of our economy. Now, I'll close with just a couple of other little sort of citations which I hope will underscore this, because these are matters that I believe need to be taken into account as we think about grand strategy and advancing the interest of the United States. I mentioned earlier that Mexico buys more from us than China. Fine. We buy a lot from Mexico, and we have a trade deficit. Part of what we buy is oil, and that fuels part of our own economic activity. But also, 40% of all Mexican imports are U.S. content. Similarly, think Canada. We have a significant trade deficit with Canada, but we now depend on Canada more than any other country in the world for oil imports. About 4 million barrels a day in January, and much of that is refined here. Right? Much of that is refined here. It's going to be important that we take a really clear-eyed look at these relationships and understand that disentangling them, parsing them, is going to be complicated. It's going to take time. And lots of American jobs, indeed millions of American jobs, depend on how we address these issues. So thank you very much.
Yeah. I just wanted to add one thing based on the ambassador's comment, and maybe Nancy can correct me. I think Senator Helms probably spent more time on Latin America than he did on any other foreign policy issues that came before the Senate in his 6 terms. And he often noted that we ignored our neighbors at our peril.
Right.
And he was the last great voice in the Senate for that view.
So, ladies and gentlemen, we have come up against our clock, which is a problem in a sense, because I had all these questions I was going to ask that I don't have time to ask. But for you, it's good. Trust me, you don't have to hear from me. But before we break, I do want to give you a chance. If any of you have a burning question, we heard a lot of interesting things from our four panelists on a lot of different topics, and I know some of you may have a question you want to ask. Let's take a question or two, and then we've got to head on out. I believe that the reception before the dinner with Ambassador Bolton and Senator Burr, I think the dinner's at 7:15, but the reception starts at 6:30, and that's not so far from now. So let's be very cognizant of the time. And Zan, let's start with you. Do we have any mics left that we can pass around?
I'll try.
Talk loud.
I'll try.
All right.
If we stipulate two things, that the president will continue tweeting and that we still have foreign enemies, how much of a risk will it be for our grand strategy in the country for our enemies to be able to interpret those tweets? And you can answer in 140 characters or less.
So I have to take the prerogative of the chair to ask a question that is obvious that precedes your answer, which is, given that all four of you have served in such distinguished capacities over a long period of time in multiple presidents and administrations, did you ever think you would hear a question about the president's tweets? All right, go ahead.
Yes, our ambassadors are tweeting as well. And in fact, in the world of diplomacy, there's a neologism called twiplomacy. Believe it or not, twiplomacy, because this is being used. The question is one of an open society, basically, and we value and promote freedom of speech, freedom of expression, openness, and perhaps that comes to a detriment when it comes to things such as security. But there's no need for this president to tell the enemy when we plan to leave or what our future deployments may or may not be, and I'm very happy that he resists the Twitter urge to give away any type of security position has been done in the past.
Anybody else want to comment on the president's tweets?
I still
That's
use
weird.
BlackBerry. I can't comment on it.
All right, John.
Yes, given the fact that when it comes to grand strategies in democracies, generally something close to consensus among public opinion is necessary to make them really successful. During the Cold War, we had a fairly good consensus that there was a problem with communism, that was the enemy. Is there a common denominator, maybe, that in this kind of divided decade that we could put at the bottom of a grand strategy that maybe would unify American opinion behind something? And I'd throw that out to anyone on that.
Yeah, I mean, ironically, we are blessed by the fact that we don't have at the moment something like the Soviet Union, staring down upon us and concentrating our attention. I think it's very important for us not to see terrorism as the equivalent of the Cold War and the Soviet Union. It could become that, but it isn't at the moment. And that's one reason to keep our eyes on the authoritarian powers, Russia and China. Because at some point, and that point may already be there for China, they don't mind exploiting of some of these developments. They too are threatened by the terrorists, I understand that, but it's not out of the question at all that both Russia and China are quite pleased with the fact that these problems, that we have problems with terrorism in Asia as well as in the Middle East. And they will use that to chip away to some extent at our position. So how do you persuade the American people? I think in the short run, you've got to set some priorities, as I indicated. In other words, you've got to be sure you don't get caught in a lot of separate, ongoing, deepening conflicts. And here's where I'm hoping that actually President Trump's nationalist tendencies will work in his favor. That is, don't go in unless it's pretty darn serious, and then try to get out as quickly as you can. Because the easiest way for us to be, I think, seriously affected by terrorism would be to get drawn into 8 or 10 different conflicts, all over the world with no priorities and with no clear objectives, as some of the panel members emphasized.
Any other comments on that one? Let's take one more question. Go.
So, Robert, just to follow on, when you lay out those statistics on the military, and you consider what has been spent, what has been being spent, I mean, it sounds like pretty dramatic destruction. How much do we need to spend?
Well, I will tell you what the Trump administration's calculus is, and that is to increase the baseline defense spending by about $50 billion a year, which puts us at about $630 billion a year. And over 10 years, I do believe that that the Defense Department believes it can recapitalize and increase the level of training and readiness for the forces. So that's now, and that's on top of everything else we do. And I'll fall back on something that Mike Mullen said, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, when I was assistant secretary. The national debt's a national security issue. And if we don't corral that, then everything else disappears in a cloud. But right now, I agree with what General Mattis and General Milley, who's the Chief of Staff of the Army, said. We need to throw money right now into readiness. And part of that does include fixing some of these problems, expanding the Navy, and getting the Air Force. We're short 1,500 pilots right now, 1,500. So we have to be creative. And in the great conundrum, and John's much better at numbers than I will ever be, the great conundrum is how do we do those things and still have money for everything else we need to do in defense? So does that mean re-looking at the way we utilize the reserve and guard component? Do we stick a lot of the heavier, the armor, for instance, into the guard? Do we, something creative like something the British are doing? If you join the Royal Air Force, they'll ask you, do you want to be an Air Vice Marshal? Okay, well, if you do, sign this. Do you want to fly your entire career? Sign this piece of paper and you're going to be a flight lieutenant until you're 55 years old. But there are creative ways that we have to think of to maximize our talents, to stretch that dollar, because we have some serious readiness issues.
Any other comments on that?
Yeah, I'll just make one, and that is that there appears to be something nearing consensus among senior military officers that while we need to substantially increase our readiness spending, as convenient as it may appear, we can't ignore diplomacy. Right? That ultimately that always costs us in the end in terms of both blood and treasure.
And that's what, let me just say, that's what I was saying earlier. And Senator Tillis mentioned it earlier. Mattis is absolutely right. He would take what the ambassador said and put it in big, bold letters. The military is only a hand that fits into the glove of diplomacy. And Dr. Gates was very clear. If you cut down on what we spend on what the ambassador does, buy me more bullets.
That's exactly what he said.
And as a soldier's son and as a somewhat practitioner of those arts, if we don't invest in diplomacy, in U.S. aid, in those international programs, those troops I talked about from North Carolina are going to be busier than they are now.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I fear that we have run out of time. Please give our panel a round of applause.